We're going to, guys, come on out. We're going to bring the boys out. It's an all-male review we're about to have here. We're going to talk about a topic that, in some ways, I have to say, it's a little bit appalling that we're still having this conversation. Not we, but we are still having this conversation after all these years about recycling and reinventing recycling, and why we still aren't where we all need to be. So we have Ron Gonen from the Closed Loop Fund. You'll hear more about what that is. Tom Carpenter from Waste Management and Tim Carey from Pepsi. To talk about where we are and more important, how we sort of jumpstart or reinvent or reinvigorate this world of recycling. And Ron, maybe you can start off just with some level setting about where we are, recycling rates, how are they going, and what's the trend line like?
Sure. Recycling rates around the United States are an interesting number to look at because oftentimes the EPA will publish a macro number of 30% of the waste in the United States is recycled. But when you look deeper, you see a completely different story, which is you have some parts of the United States where recycling is phenomenal, as high as anywhere in the world. You have some other parts of the United States where it's just kind of doing okay, and other parts where there's literally no recycling going on. And so the United States is really a hodgepodge of best-in-class average, and then basically about as bad as you can get. And so right now it's actually difficult to get an aggregate number because we have so many different scenarios going on.
So why are we even talking about reinventing? This is what needs to be reinvented. I hear that there's still massive amounts of material that's just not getting into the recycling stream, and some cities, municipalities, even businesses that started off doing okay but are kind of either plateauing or backsliding.
It's an excellent point. I'm not sure that we need to be using the word reinvent. What we probably need to be using is the word replicate. So we have cities and communities in the United States that have demonstrated excellent recycling programs, and what you really need is for the parts of the United States where you see low recycling rates to enable them to replicate what the best cities have done. Now, the complexity there is in order to replicate what the best cities have done, oftentimes you need a certain amount of capital to do that, because what the cities have done that have high recycling rates is that they've put very robust infrastructure into place to make it very convenient for people to recycle and very cost-effective to process those materials because the recycling facilities are local.
And of course, that's where the Closed Loop Fund comes in. Give us a little bit of background. Whose money? What are you trying to do?
The Closed Loop Fund is a $100 million infrastructure loan fund. The limited partners in the fund are some of the world's largest consumer goods companies like Pepsi and Unilever and Johnson & Johnson, along with some of the world's largest retailers like Walmart. And
they've all put money into this.
They've all committed capital to this, and we are using that capital to provide zero-interest loans to municipalities to build that infrastructure. So if there's a municipality that doesn't have a curbside recycling program, you don't really need to provide a lot of messaging or rah about please recycle. The residents literally can't recycle. And shockingly, we estimate that about 50% of US households don't have access to an adequate curbside recycling program.
And I assume we're talking about the basics, cardboard, and paper, aluminum, glass, some plastics.
Right now, we're primarily focused on paper, metal, glass, plastic, traditional curbside recycling programs. If this works, we'd like to replicate the Closed Loop Fund in organics and textiles and e-waste as well. But if you take a municipality that literally has no curbside recycling program, we will come in and finance the purchase of single-stream recycling carts. The cost of those carts is paid back over a 10-year period from the landfill diversion savings and the commodity revenue.
And we're just, so we want to move on to Tom in a second, but where are you? You started this last year, I believe. Are you making loans now? Are you actually, last time we talked, I think you were still sort of putting the capital together.
We opened up the application process in October. We got over 20 submissions from municipalities around the country in the first 30 days, and we'll be making the first 4 investments in March.
So, Tom, your company is in the recycling business. I think you are the largest recycling company in where? North America?
North America.
The planet?
Yep.
North America?
Yeah.
Okay. What's the role? I mean, you do what your customers want. You work for customers, which are municipalities, the same kind, and businesses.
Right.
But look, I think we're focusing here on consumer household recycling, because B2B, frankly, I think, and this I guess is a question, B2B relative to consumer recycling, doing better, I think, right?
Yeah, I'd say, businesses are doing really well, especially in the manufacturing sector. You see really high rates of recycling. Where you do have some difficulty are those pockets of, the nation that don't have the infrastructure. The kind of that low-hanging fruit has been snatched up, but when you get onto the consumer side, and that's where we're seeing businesses kind of reach further outside of their supply chain, looking at the impacts, or how do they capture those materials that they've invested a lot of time and resources in, and there's that embodied energy within those materials. And PepsiCo's a good example of wanting to get those materials back and caring about that. And then looking at, throughout there, completing the infrastructure, but then completing on, how do you recover those materials? Because that's the biggest thing. We call them recycling centers, but they're recovery centers, recovery facilities. And if you can't recover the material, if it's difficult to do that, if there's added costs within that, and that's what we're seeing in the recycling industry is, the waste stream is changing quite a bit, the recycling stream is changing, and you have pockets where the contamination's getting so high because people are trying to do the right thing. They're throwing more things into the single stream bin, but it's contaminating, the waste stream a bit more, the recycling stream, and it's just adding additional costs. So you kind of have those two different things from the educational standpoint of engaging folks more and finding those pockets of success, and how do you get them to recycle more, but then also on the other side, how do they recycle the right things? So we have that kind of campaign, Recycle Off and Recycle Right, is what we're trying to push more so to kind of do the right thing, but then also increase those rates continually as well.
So let's talk about, and first with you, Tom, then over to Tim, what is the opportunity and what some might say the responsibility of companies as not necessarily not on recycling their own waste. Well, that's assuming that's sort of underway and there's some processes and some bottom lines, but in encouraging, incenting, driving household recycling. So I'm just spitballing here, but there seems to be that obviously working with employees is one thing. Working with municipal governments where they have operations seems to be another. Maybe, facilitating education. Where are the opportunities, is what I'm getting to here, for companies to play a role in accelerating and expanding residential recycling?
I think it is, a big piece of it's closing the loop with kind of the educational aspect and realizing that those items have value. If you think of recycling, we're still casting it away. There's still this perceived non-value of materials. If they were, realized to have that value, we may not have that issue. So I think that conversation, especially for companies that are selling products, I think, if that consumers, their last touch of that bottle or that can or other things is to throw it in the trash can versus recycling and realizing there's a campaign around that, getting it back into the supply chain, I think there's that engagement point. The other thing is, I think, as you see with the Closed Loop Fund, is really building out the gap that exists within that infrastructure and having that conversation with municipalities, with the waste recyclers, with the manufacturers on, these new products that are coming down the line. How do we get those materials back in the supply chain? How do we capture those raw goods and really kind of design around that?
What I want to try and understand is what's the opportunity for these companies in this room, online, who are watching us, who aren't in the recycling business, but maybe they're doing really well with zero waste goals in their own operations, to play be a positive force in accelerating this? Is it getting involved with government? Are there market-based things? Are there great incentives? Where are you seeing some good examples for these guys to move along this goal that all of us want to do?
I see the biggest thing is really kind of from that risk standpoint, looking at just the cost of your raw materials. And PepsiCo could probably speak to this, but if you look at the cost, the rising cost, the risks within that, to really kind of truly close the loop or this circular economy that we keep talking about, I think by actually moving forward, having the conversation, but bringing the right groups together and having that discussion, actually truly closing the loop instead of just your products are out there and you're hoping that those materials get back. I think there's a real opportunity. If you look at the economics, there's great cost savings if we start to close the loop and really get those materials back in the supply chain versus just harvesting raw materials and then disposing of them.
Great. Well, Tim, let's turn to you because you've got this sort of two sides of this. One, you make do you manufacture the bottles and cans, or do you buy those from third parties?
Frequently we manufacture them ourselves. We might buy a preform.
Yeah. So you're making these, and so you're creating these things that become part of the waste stream. But you're also, you suffer as it were, in that from the low recycling rates, because these are things that you can recover more profitably than you can make. So there's an incentive for you to get a lot of this back. Talk about what's the business opportunity for Pepsi in all this waste.
So I want to touch on two things. One is you use the term residential. That's only a part of the problem. Residential, actually, there's hope. The fund is a great example of why there's hope. There's this whole infrastructure called on the go. It's like when you're driving around in your car, when you're walking in a city, when you're at a 5K race, and you've got a bottle or a can in your hand. It's like, what the heck do you do with it? Very few of the United States citizens will take that thing home and put it in their bin.
Everybody in this room does that. Good to hear.
So there's one opportunity to improve the availability and access of recycle bins in the public.
So is that street corners? Is that stadiums? Is it parks? Is it shopping malls? Where are those big opportunities?
I mean, we're trying to figure that out, but one great example is convenience and gas stores. If you ever look in a trash can at a convenience and gas store, that's where people empty their car out. It's like half of it is cans and bottles. So that's a great idea. And if you've been to a convenience and gas store, none of them have recycle bins. So we're putting some out there. But you asked about the business opportunity. A good percentage of our product cost is the container. And if you think about it, no one buys it for the container. They drink the beverage, they're having a great time. The container may only last 15 minutes in a consumer's life, and that's a lot of the cost. And then it typically gets discarded, hopefully it gets recycled. And so the opportunity to get it back and to reuse it is I think the real business opportunity. And if we can get numbers back that are significant enough, maybe we can actually make a dent in the cost, because today using post-consumer recycled content is at parity if you're lucky with virgin. And if we can get a little bit more, if we can get the collection process to be more efficient, if we can get the sorting processes at a material recycling facility to be a little more efficient, then we can get that price down. We can start to create real demand, and then I think everyone will hopefully participate.
I think you told me that the number $300 million came in. That's the value of Pepsi's alone packaging that goes into the waste stream recoverable potential?
The number I used was something like that, but it was on that order. And what I said is if we got back every can and bottle that we put into the market that's not going to a collection system today, and we took it into our facilities and we gave it to Waste Management at our current contract rates, that would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. So it's hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue just for the cans and bottles that go into the market in the United States.
Tim, I think, Ron, I think Tim hit on something that is at the heart of what the Closed Loop Fund is about, which is the business value of I think, one of the incentives for all these investors that you have to increase recycling, which is that by increasing the amount of recovered assets, that it brings the prices down and makes them more available for them as manufacturers and as retailers. Is that what's going on here?
Absolutely. That's one of the things that we've been able to do with the Closed Loop Fund is align the incentives of everybody involved in order to provide zero interest loans. So our investors are interested in getting their principal back, and they're interested in getting that tonnage back into their supply chain. They're not interested in the direct IRR on that 100 million or that specific capital that they've put in. So that's why we're able to offer these loans at very, very cheap rates, is that they're interested in getting their principal back and they're interested in getting that tonnage back.
I'd be curious whether the value, this is just sort of idle curiosity, of the value of those materials represents an attractive rate of return for the principal. Has anyone calculated that?
It should represent a very attractive return for the principal. The issue right now, if you take a waste management as an example, is if you build a MRF and you're able to
Municipal recycling facility where everything comes in and gets sorted.
Exactly. So if you build a recycling facility and that recycling facility is full of material, you're going to have a very profitable recycling facility. The issue today is you could build that facility and you may only be at 60% capacity or 70% capacity. And so what we're trying to do is build that infrastructure by getting those recycling carts out there, taking some of the risk off of the private companies that want to build that infrastructure so that we can get the supply up to the point in which these recycling facilities are full. Then more private capital will want to come in because it's more profitable to run these facilities. And now that you've increased supply, companies like Pepsi or Unilever or Colgate-Palmolive or Johnson & Johnson can say, there's a lot of supply out there of recycled material. We can now fully integrate it into our supply chain. And now the industry begins to work really well and becomes very attractive.
I'd love to hear from Tom and I think Tim and Ron too, is around sort of what you hear from consumers. Because for a long time, recycling was the, people call it the gateway drug to environmental activities or sustainability. Because it was the easy thing to do, and in fact, probably to a fault, where people said, "Oh, it's okay, I can drive my Hummer. It's I'm recycling at home," and people almost use that as a way to rationalize everything else. What does it take from their perspective to grow this? And just to pile onto that question, one of the things I hear a lot is that recycling is just too damn complicated. What do you hear from consumers, Tom?
We've definitely heard that they want to recycle. Most communities and those that have been successful, if you look at the programs, it's really kind of that personal engagement, almost going door to door, reaching out and explaining exactly what they need to do, but making it easy. So, recycling bottles, cans, people get that. It's when you get into some of these other things and you see kind of resin symbols or other kind of things that we've done to make it confusing. And then if you look at like recycling infrastructure, whether it be at a hotel or out in the public, each one changes from place to place, so signage is different. So we've really confused the public. And then if you, in other areas where you start to add organics and other things, people don't know what to do. And oftentimes, I've even had kind of conversations on, whether they can recycle like a can or a bottle, that knowledge just isn't there. So it's a mixed bag where, people are either confused, or you have some households that are just trying to do the right thing and they're putting anything that's plastic or anything that looks like it could be recyclable, they're just throwing it in the recycling bin, and that's causing a problem down the road because you're adding more contamination. So I think the programs that we've seen successful is where there's great engagement, there's great understanding, simplify it. That's the way it works in business. We need to do that on a broader scale within communities.
Tim, I imagine that you all do a fair amount on consumer research on recycling, and I hear a lot that the kids, the millennials, and whoever the generation is behind the millennials, I heard it called Z recently, gets it, and this is they're sort of native to this. Is that true? Because I'm still unclear whether in theory that sounds right and it sounds hopeful, but I'm not sure that's true in practice.
It's a great question. I think they get it emotionally, and we hear from them. They talk about it. They ask about it in interviews when we bring them in. But there's still an action hurdle. And so we started this group called PepsiCo Recycling. It's an internal organization, and the whole idea is to crack the code on this thing. We're, 40 years in? And if you look at beverage container recycling rates, they're around 42% nationally. It's like 40 years, and that's as far as we have gotten. And so what we have...
And that's at all age groups, that's not just any...
Yes, yeah. That's all. But what we've found is that it needs to be extraordinarily simple and clear. And so we believe it's a simple act. If we convince people it's a simple act, just take your container, put it in a recycle bin, and you'll have a big impact. The challenge, again, is having... No one wants to take it with them. So if you don't have a recycle bin next to a trash container, you won't get recycling. You have to have a recycle bin again next to every trash container, or it won't really happen on the go in particular. And that's why it works in the house, I think, is that typically you'll have that bin right next to your trash can. And they can make the act. So again, a simple act, a big impact. People aren't there yet. They still feel like it is hard because all evidence suggests that it's a very...
Before we get to questions, I want to, what's it going to take to get us there? After all, I'm getting choked up just thinking about this. After all these years of trying to, to do this, we're what, 45 years since, into the what's called the modern environmental movement, and we're still trying to crack the code on recycling. Ron, I mean, give us some hope.
Well, I think we've cracked the code. The question is, how do we make sure that that code now gets replicated and used in all parts of the United States? And so I think two things need to happen. First, on the messaging side, we need to graduate from simply talking about recycling as the right thing to do for the environment, which it absolutely is, but we need to graduate the conversation to one in which people understand the economic benefit to recycling in their local community or the economic risk of not recycling. So if you live in a city and you recycle everything, there's no cost to sending your material to landfill and your city generates revenue. If your neighbor throws everything in the garbage, the city has to use tax dollars to send that material to landfill and there's no revenue generation. But they're not having the burden of that cost placed solely on them. You're going to share part of that cost. And so people need to start to understand the economic benefits and the economic risks associated with how waste is managed in their city. And if we can communicate that, I think many more people who may not feel that passionately about the environment will change their behavior. So that's one key thing we need to do. The other key thing, and Tim was touching on this, is we need to make sure that at every touch point that a person has with a consumer good, it's very convenient for them to recycle. And that means that the infrastructure is in place in their home. They have a recycling container that's large with wheels and a lid, and the city collects it frequently. When they're on the go, walking around the street or in their car, it's very convenient for them to recycle either at the gas station or the park. And then at their place of business or where they work, it needs to similarly be very easy for them to recycle. Any break in that chain begins to get confusing for people in terms of what should I be doing here and what should I be doing there, and then they check out. Yeah. And so it's graduating the communication to one in which people understand the value and then making sure that it's very convenient for people to recycle wherever they're located.
Before we get to a question, I want to telegraph what I'm going to ask you to tell us at the end of this, which is that, because we're all over the map here, there's so many different, it's a very complex thing, something as simple as recycling, and we've covered a lot of ground in the last 18 or so minutes. What's the one takeaway that you want the business world to know? What's the one thing that you want them to walk away with? And don't say plastics. No, I'm just kidding. But I want to get to that. But Lauren, what do we got online? I imagine it's a pretty good conversation.
Of interest in financial incentives for recycling. Minneapolis was tossed out as a municipality with a rate structure that charges more for landfill than recycling, but anything businesses or other institutions could be doing with product buybacks or other approaches in this realm.
Ron?
I think you've seen it on both sides. So you've seen areas of the country that are doing it well with kind of policy and so on. You have other parts, up kind of Pacific Northwest that's been just brute force really engagement. So I think ultimately it's, as businesses, I think it's connecting that communication, making recycling matter more than it does. Everybody agrees that it's the right thing, but until it matters to you individually, you're not willing to kind of find that recycling container. So whether it's maybe financial or kind of just that personal message of this is what we do, this is how we as a society take care of these materials, and this is the cost impact and that impacts me personally, whether or not I get a reward. I think that's the big thing that we need to start connecting.
We'll take another one quickly.
Yeah, off that point, there's also interest in the on-the-ground education and communication component of all this. Printing flyers would obviously be a little ironic in this context. So what about recycling as part of school curriculum, advertising? What else can you do to really drive that message home?
Tim?
Well, I mean, we believe that you have to start early. I mean, we found actually if you can convince school children to recycle, they will convince their parents. And so we have a schools recycling program, and part of the idea is to get them started young, to get them to believe in it, create a lifelong habit, because then I won't have to do that when they're 20 or 30. So that's the whole objective. And we actually had families come up to us and say, I brought cans and bottles into your program, this was great, I love it. I never recycled anything. Now I'm recycling newspapers, I'm recycling tin cans. So it definitely is about education, getting people when they're young, making it so damn easy to tell, what do I recycle here? Where's the recycle bin?
Yeah, so let's go down the line really quickly, and what's the one takeaway that you want people to take away?
If you're in the consumer goods industry, the value to having a robust recycling system in the United States is, number one, it should reduce your costs if we can get to scale. Number two, it's going to reduce your regulatory risk. Europe has a much different way of getting this problem solved, and it involves a lot of regulation. And number three, consumers have communicated that this is something they want. They want to be able to recycle products. So there's a lot of value to you as a company if you can get this solved. In the past, it was almost impossible for an individual company to do anything that would create systemic change. You now have something like the Closed Loop Fund, where 10 of the largest consumer goods companies in the world have come together to pool their capital together to fix this. And I would encourage you to either join us or find some other program that is creating catalytic change and join them.
Great, nice takeaway with a self-plug. I like that. Tom?
I think next to kind of the infrastructure, I think as businesses, as within our communities, I think we really have a chance to kind of connect the dots and really make recycling matter a great deal. So really kind of encouraging on that messaging. I've seen it work. We've done a lot of studies, but I think together brands and companies can come together and tell that story, make it easy, but really kind of that behavioral engagement. You have other aspects of sustainability, energy, water. You could put engineering controls, recycling, so behavioral driven. And I think that's great from a brand perspective to really latch on to that and be able to communicate to your consumers.
Tim, get the last word.
All right, if you have a public footprint, if you have a building, an office, a city park, a municipality, anywhere, make sure there's a recycling bin there. You'll look out, there's trash cans everywhere. Make sure there's a recycling bin next to it. We can help in the process.
And, well, you've given us a lot of brain food, which is on how to make this a no-brainer, but we've got a long way to go, and I hope that we can not have to be thinking about this in years forward, so we can move, just be getting on to the even tougher stuff, like driving. Please join me in thanking Tim, Tom, and Ron.